Welcome to the debate. I want you to picture the last time you walked into an urgent care clinic. Maybe you sliced your finger cutting a bagel, or your toddler woke up with a fever of 102. You walked in there, and whether you realized it or not, you weren't just looking for a doctor. You were evaluating a product. You were looking at the paint, checking the cleanliness, and most importantly, glancing at your watch to see how many minutes ticked by.
And that right there, that glancing at the watch mindset, is exactly what we need to unpack today. Because when we treat patients like critics reviewing a bistro on Yelp, we fundamentally change the DNA of how medicine is practiced. And I'm not convinced it's for the better.
That is the tension we are exploring. We are diving deep into the Net Promoter Score, or NPS. It's a simple metric born in the boardrooms of companies like Apple and Tesla, designed to measure one thing: consumer loyalty. But now it's taken over the urgent care industry. The core question is this: is NPS the tool that finally forces healthcare to respect the patient's time and voice, or is it a dangerous trap that prioritizes a 5-star review over clinical integrity?
I'm taking the position that it is a trap. I argue that applying retail metrics to clinical environments creates perverse incentives, specifically the pressure to overprescribe antibiotics, and relies on biased data that ignores the sickest patients in the system.
And I am here to argue that NPS is essential. It is the only metric that effectively holds a mirror up to the industry. It drives growth, it identifies operational failures, and frankly, it gives the patient a seat at the table in a system that has historically ignored them.
It gives them a seat, sure. But I'm worried that by focusing on the furniture, we're neglecting the foundation of the house.
Well, let's get into it. I want to start by framing the reality of the market. I look at urgent care and I see a service industry. For decades, medicine operated with this paternalistic view that the doctor knows best and, you'll wait until I'm ready because I'm important. That doesn't fly anymore. The data is clear. The average Net Promoter Score for urgent care is sitting around an 86. Compare that to the broader traditional healthcare industry, which struggles to hit 58.
That is a massive gap. I'll give you that.
It's a massive gap because urgent care makes a specific promise. We respect your time. NPS asks the ultimate question. On a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend us to a friend or colleague? If you score a 9 or 10, you are a promoter. You are the engine of organic growth. If you score 0 through 6, you're a detractor. You are a reputational liability. In a market this competitive, you just can't survive if you are ignoring the people paying the bill.
See, I don't dispute that patients like the retail model. I mean, who wouldn't want an espresso while waiting for a flu shot? My argument is that medicine is not retail. Maximizing customer loyalty, which is what NPS measures, is fundamentally different from maximizing health outcomes. When you adopt the mantra that the customer is always right in a clinical setting, you enter the NPS trap.
The NPS trap. Unpack that a bit for me.
It means you can have incredibly high scores while delivering poor or even dangerous clinical care. The pressure to maintain those scores creates an assembly line mentality. We are seeing providers push to manage throughput at roughly 4 patients per hour. I mean, do the math on that. That is 15 minutes per human life. When you combine that speed with the fear of a bad survey, you get an environment that is ripe for error. We need to be protecting the patient from the system, not asking them to rate the decor, because people want to get it over with. They view the doctor as a pit stop.
Exactly. And why shouldn't they? The national average visit duration is 59.6 minutes. The industry gold standard is in and out in under an hour. If you look at Gen Z, their NPS scores bottom out the fastest. They have zero tolerance for waiting. This isn't the industry forcing speed on patients. This is the market demanding efficiency. If a mother is waiting 3 hours for a simple strep test for her crying toddler, that isn't just slow medicine, that is a failure of care.
I agree that a 3-hour wait is a failure. No one is arguing for inefficiency. But have you looked at how clinics are actually achieving those under-an-hour metrics? The obsession with door-to-provider times, specifically targeting under 30 minutes, has led to rampant gaming of the system.
Gaming? In what sense?
We see the triage distortion tactic constantly. This is where a clinic places a provider, usually an NP or a PA, in the triage area, Their sole job is to say hello, ask 3 questions, and technically initiate the chart.
Which stops the clock.
It stops the metrics clock. The dashboard turns green, the manager gets their bonus, but the patient, they are sent right back to the waiting room or an exam room to sit for another hour before any actual treatment happens. It creates a statistical lie. You satisfy the algorithm, but you've lied to the patient. And trust me, when they realize they haven't actually been seen, that satisfaction score drops like a brick.
I'll acknowledge that gaming metrics is a failure of management, not the metric itself. Any number can be manipulated if the leadership is dishonest. But the underlying principle, reducing friction, is valid. High wait times set a negative tone for the entire encounter. If you make someone wait 2 hours, it doesn't matter how brilliant your diagnosis is, they are starting that interaction angry. They're already a detractor before you've even listened to their lungs.
But the flip side is that speed pressure causes cognitive errors. It leads to what we call faulty synthesis.
Faulty synthesis?
That is the clinical term for when a provider fails to integrate the patient's history because they are rushing to meet that 15-minute benchmark. They hear cough, they think bronchitis, they write the script, and they move on. They miss the subtle red flags, the travel history, the occupational exposure, because they are eyeing the clock. Misdiagnosis is the top malpractice claim against nurse practitioners in acute care settings. That is the price of your efficiency. You might get a high NPS for speed, but you might miss the early signs of sepsis.
I would argue that efficient systems can actually reduce errors by streamlining workflows. Standardization prevents improvisation, but I want to pivot to your point about clinical quality. You mentioned earlier that high scores can mask bad medicine. I assume you're referring to the antibiotic trap?
I am, and honestly, this is the strongest argument against using NPS as a primary metric in urgent care. It incentivizes bad medicine. The evidence is overwhelming. Patient satisfaction is directly associated with receiving antibiotics, even for viral infections where they are completely inappropriate.
That's a correlation, though. Is it really driving behavior?
It is absolutely a behavioral driver. Think about the provider. They know that if they send the patient home with nothing but advice to rest and hydrate, they risk a negative review. The patient feels shortchanged. I paid my copay, I want my Z-Pack. Providers who perceive that a patient expects antibiotics are significantly more likely to prescribe them. We see individual providers in the same clinic ranging from a 3% prescribing rate to a 94% rate for similar respiratory encounters. That massive variance isn't clinical nuance. That is capitulation to the survey. They are buying a good score with a prescription pad.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it creates a false binary. It assumes the only way to satisfy a patient is to give them exactly what they ask for. That's a failure of communication, not a failure of the metric. Low prescribing doesn't have to mean low NPS.
In the real world, it often does.
Only if the provider simply says no and walks out. There is robust data on educational interventions. If a provider takes the time to explain why an antibiotic isn't needed, satisfaction can remain high. I want to bring up the heart-head-heart service recovery model here.
Walk us through that.
It's a communication framework used by leading systems like United Regional. You start with the heart, empathy. You validate their feeling. I can see you are miserable, and I know you want to get better fast. Then you move to the head, the logic. However, this is viral, and an antibiotic won't kill a virus, but it might give you side effects. And you finish with the heart again, compassion, and a plan. Here's exactly what we are going to do to manage your symptoms. If a provider communicates with empathy rather than just refusal, they can maintain high satisfaction and clinical standards simultaneously.
That sounds lovely, it really does. But try doing heart-head-heart during a quademic.
A quademic?
When you have flu, COVID, RSV, and strep all surging at the same time. You are seeing 4 patients an hour. The lobby is standing room only. You do not have time for a nuanced, empathetic negotiation on viral load and antibiotic stewardship. The pressure of volume overwhelms the ability to have those heart-head-heart conversations. It is faster to write the script than to have the fight. And the NPS structure rewards the provider who writes the script because the patient leaves happy.
Then the solution is to adjust staffing models during surges, not to throw out the metric that tells us how patients feel. If we stop measuring sentiment, we are flying blind. But I want to pivot to the metric itself. You called the data biased earlier. What did you mean by that?
It is mathematically flawed. We are making massive operational decisions based on a J-shaped participation curve.
Explain the J shape for the listeners.
Visualize a graph. On the left, you have a spike of people who hate you, the detractors. On the right, a spike of people who love you, the promoters. But in the middle, a flat line. That is the silent 70%. These are the people who had a routine, decent experience. They got their flu shot, they left. They deleted the email survey. They just don't care enough to click.
That is common in all survey data, not just healthcare.
But in healthcare, it has a dangerous implication. Studies suggest that non-respondents often have higher hospitalization and mortality rates. They are sicker, or they are underserved populations who don't have the time, the internet access, or the literacy to fill out digital surveys. So your glorious NPS of 86 isn't a picture of your patient base. It's a picture of the healthy, wealthy, and happy. You are ignoring the sickest and most vulnerable people because they aren't clicking the link.
That is a valid statistical critique, though I would frame it differently. Even if the data represents the extremes, it is highly actionable. You call the detractors furious, but I call them an opportunity. Data from United Regional showed something incredible. When they unblinded the data, meaning they looked at who specifically gave a bad score, and conducted 24-hour follow-up calls, they converted 71% of detractors into promoters.
71%? That seems incredibly high.
It's the power of simply being heard. By closing the feedback loop, a nurse leader calls them within a day. They say, "I saw your comment about the rude receptionist. I'm sorry. Here's what we are doing to fix it." That call transforms the relationship. It turns a liability into trust. You can't do that if you aren't measuring sentiment in the first place. You just have a patient bad-mouthing you to the community, and you'd never know why.
I agree that service recovery is valuable, but you are recovering from a self-inflicted wound if the system itself caused the problem. And frankly, chasing that score focuses everyone on the customer service aspect, the smile, the wait time, while ignoring the invisible operational failures that actually matter more.
We aren't suggesting NPS should be the only metric.
Good, because it can't be.
I agree. We need to expand the dashboard. For example, the Customer Effort Score, CES. This measures friction. How hard was it to book the appointment online? Did the website crash? How hard was it to pay the bill? You can have a brilliant doctor, but if your website is from 1999 and the patient spends 20 minutes trying to book a slot, your loyalty will plummet.
I would go further. We need to measure financial transparency as a core component of satisfaction. You know what creates a detractor faster than a long wait time? A surprise bill 3 months later.
Absolutely. The financial experience is part of the patient experience now. With the No Surprises Act, transparency is the law, but it's also just good business.
It is, but let's look at the hidden risks there. If you don't track billing integrity, specifically things like incident to billing risks, you are sitting on a legal landmine.
For those not in the weeds of billing, explain incident to.
It's a billing provision where a clinic bills for a nurse practitioner's services at 100% of the physician rate, claiming the physician was directly supervising. It's a way to maximize revenue. But if the physician wasn't actually in the building, that's fraud. There was a recent figure of $44 million in settlements regarding False Claims Act violations in this space. My point is, you can have an NPS of 90, but if your clinic is being sued for fraud because you prioritized revenue and speed over compliance, that score is meaningless.
That's fair. Financial transparency and legal compliance help everyone. But I want to stick to the patient experience metrics. We mentioned CES. I also think CSAT, Customer Satisfaction Score, has a place for specific interactions. NPS is the long-term relationship, CSAT is the transactional snapshot. How was your lab draw today?
Sure, measure the lab draw, but I insist on incorporating clinical safety metrics to counterbalance the happy metrics. We need to track closing the loop on referrals and lab results.
What do you mean by closing the loop in this context?
In urgent care, we send people out constantly. We send labs to Quest or LabCorp. We refer patients to cardiologists. Up to 50% of referrals in ambulatory settings are never completed. If we miss an abnormal lab result because they didn't have a protocol like IPASS or the PrEP for Cs, that patient could have a delayed cancer diagnosis. You can have a patient who loves you, gives you an NPS of 10 because you were nice, but if you failed to call them about their abnormal kidney function, you have failed them clinically.
I agree. Closing the loop is critical. In fact, I'd argue that the failure to communicate those results is exactly the kind of thing that creates detractors in the long run. So, safety and satisfaction are not mutually exclusive. They are reinforcing. If you're safe, you build trust. If you build trust, you get loyalty.
They can be reinforcing, but only if the leadership prioritizes safety over the score when they conflict. If the manager's bonus is tied to NPS, the manager will focus on the smile, not the lab log. That is human nature.
Which is why we need a balanced scorecard. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We cannot go back to the days of paternalistic medicine where we didn't care if the patient waited 4 hours or felt disrespected. The urgent care model works because it treats patients as people's time matters. NPS is the tool that keeps us honest about that promise.
And I simply warn that treating them as consumers first and patients second is a slippery slope. When the metric becomes the target, you lose sight of the mission.
So as we look at this tension, it really comes down to how we view the person walking through the door. Are they a consumer shopping for convenience or a patient needing protection?
They're both. And that is the problem. They want the convenience of a consumer. They want it now, and they want it their way. But they have the vulnerability of a patient. They don't know what they need medically. They only know what they want.
My final take is this. We must listen to the patient. You cannot run a modern healthcare organization in the dark. A multi-metric approach combining NPS for loyalty, CES for friction, and CSAT for specifics creates a low-effort journey. That is what builds trust. That is what keeps the doors open. We have to embrace the feedback, even if it's uncomfortable.
And my final take is that we must protect the patient from the system we are building. Chasing the score is a race to the bottom unless it is anchored by ironclad clinical quality and billing integrity. If you are prescribing antibiotics just to get a 10 on a survey, you aren't a healer, you're a retailer. We need a multidimensional feedback ecosystem, yes, but one that values a correct diagnosis more than a quick one.
Perhaps the solution lies in that ecosystem concept. It's not just one number. It's a conversation between the data and the clinical reality.
On that, we can agree.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. We hope this challenges you to look at those survey scores a little differently next time they cross your desk.
And maybe look at the clinical charts behind them just as closely.
Until next time.